Hi, welcome to Finding Fuscata. I'm Sean. This is Fundamentals number 3. If you'd like to learn more about the coaching program this is part of, stick around to the end. I'll talk about it there. But this presentation is about the 8th Hermetic Principle, sometimes called the Principle of Care, sometimes called the Generative Principle, sometimes called the Lost Principle. And what it does is it is the principle that makes this statement here true: where attention goes, energy flows. And it seems like a big secret. People talk about it like it's this lost, mysterious thing. But as you go through the presentation, as you learn more about this, you'll see that it's something that you do all the time. And I'll just show you how to apply it, why it works, and how to use it more intentionally. So, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, this slide here is actually taken from the workbook that I have available for this coaching program. If you want to get a copy of this workbook to follow along, it's a free PDF that you can download from my YouTube channel, or you can go to school.com, skool.com, / Finding Fuscata. And if you join our group there, it's also available there, along with these slides. So please feel free to reach out. It's a great community over there. But if you don't have a copy of that, then we're going to go along with these real quick. So just real quick for the workbook, let's just go over these. So I want you to be thinking about these things in the next two slides as I'm going through the presentation. And at the end, we'll break these down some more, okay? So the summary of this overall lesson is, number one, the things that get your attention tend to increase. Number two, the things that you care about most start to adjust your frequency. We'll talk about frequency a little bit more. I'm going to go in depth into it in another lesson. But the idea there is the Hermetic Principle that everything vibrates, and including you, and whatever frequency you are, there are other things that match that frequency get magnetically attracted to you. Okay, so that's just kind of a nutshell, but we'll go into more of that in other lessons. And then your frequency attracts objects, events, and people that are a match. And we'll talk about how the 8th Hermetic Principle makes that happen a little bit later on. So now, the questions that you'll have in the workbook are these two, and I want you to be thinking about these as I'm going through the lesson, is describing the generative principle in your own words. And remember, I may talk about it as the 8th Hermetic Principle, or the generative principle, or the principle of care. Those three are kind of used interchangeably, okay? And then, last thing is, look around you. If it's true that your life is an echo of if it's true that our life is an echo of our past cares, thoughts, and vibrations, list at least 3 things you apparently cared about. And that'll make more sense as I unpack it. Maybe it makes sense to you now, but I really want to get down to the nuts and bolts of how and why that works. Okay? So keep these things in mind as we're going through. So, the 8th Hermetic Principle, how we apply the 8th Hermetic Principle of care, or the generative it says principle, but my noggin's in the way. What are you going to do? All right. So in this slide presentation, we're going to talk about what is the generative principle, how does it interface with the others, and by the others, I mean the other 7 Hermetic Principles. And if you haven't seen that video yet, in a minute, I'm going to do a quick overview of those. And then how does this apply to our lives, and how can we use it more consciously? That's what I talked about in the beginning, is that it doesn't matter if you know all of these sorts of things. If you don't know how to apply it, if you don't know how to apply it consciously, then it's kind of useless. It's like Joe Dispenza says a lot, that ours is a time, in our time, it's not good enough to know, you have to know how. So that's what this is about, okay? So, okay, here's a quick review of the 7 Hermetic Principles. Mentalism, the all is mind, the universe is mental. I've talked a lot about this, that everything we see around us is a projection of what's in our mind, and the all, if you think about the all in terms of like all caps, capital THE, capital ALL, that encompasses everything that is physical and non-physical, the real and the not yet real, the future and the past and the present. So it's like the all, like everything that's there and available, okay? And that's all mind. If you want to know more about that, check out in the other video. Then you got the principle of correspondence, sometimes called the mirror principle, or it can be applied and used as the mirror principle. But in here, it's that classic phrase of as above, so below, as below, so above. Some people will say as within, so without, as without, so within. So there's always correspondence between all the different things that you're looking at. The principle of vibration is essentially the same thing as frequency, but it's the idea that everything vibrates. So this microphone, my voice is vibrating, but then if you go down to the atomic level, the microphone seems solid. But if you go down to the very basic level, it's all made of atoms and muons and quarks and all that other kind of stuff, and all those things are constantly vibrating, right? So there's that one. Then you got polarity, the principle that everything is dual, everything has its poles, and everything has its pair of opposites. So you can't have north without south. You can't have east without west. You can't have right without left, right? But because everything is on a polarity, everything kind of fluctuates back and forth. So in the other video, we talked about temperature, right? Like you can't say, like we call different things hot. Like in the room right now, it's hot because it's, you know, coming up on summer and I'm in the attic and it's warm and I have the air conditioner turned off. So it's warm in here. But, you know, if I had just come out of the Death Valley and it was 130 degrees and I came into this room, I'd feel really, really comfortable. So all those sorts of things, it can be very subjective what hot and cold and light and dark and left and right and all those sorts of things can be, okay? So that's the principle of polarity. Principle of rhythm is that everything flows and moves. Everything comes in and goes out. The tides go in and out. The earth spins around the sun. Your moods go up and down. The economy rises and falls. Empires rise and falls. Everything has a rhythm to it. Okay. And then the principle of cause and effect, which is that everything has its cause, and every cause has its effect, and every effect has its cause. And there's nothing is immune from that law. Every single thing. And the phrase to take away from that one is that randomness is the word that we use for things where we don't understand the cause. Right? So randomness is not a thing. It's just when we don't understand the cause and we don't fully understand the effect, we call it random. Okay? And then you've got gender. And remember, this is not necessarily sexuality as we understand it. So gender, there's the masculine principle and the feminine principle, which are in some ways embodied within our biology and in the biology of other creatures and other plants and anything that's alive has this gender about them. And even things that we don't think of as alive still have gender, because gender is embodied in everything. But the way it's important to think about this is that the feminine is the receptive principle and the masculine is the penetrative principle. So you think about, I think he talked about this in, was it Dan Brown wrote the book about all this Gnostic stuff, but he talked about, like the pyramid like this. You see this like on rank insignias in the military. Like I was a master sergeant, so I had the roof over the top. Well, this is a penetrative, right, symbol, but then this is also the receptive. So some people talk about the Star of David and how that's both penetrative and receptive, because it's a triangle this way and then a triangle. I'm not good at making triangles. It's a triangle this way and a triangle. You know what I mean. It's two different triangles. So, but that represents the penetrative and the receptive principles. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. So let's move on. Okay, so you've heard me say about the 8th Hermetic Principle that it can be called the 8th Hermetic Principle or the Generative Principle or the Principle of Care. And those three terms can be used interchangeably. Now, I also refer to it as the encapsulating principle, but that's because that's what it does. That's not what it is. It's a clear distinction. So what I mean is that the principle of rhythm is the principle of rhythm, whereas the principle of rhythm does something else. Okay? So the principle of rhythm moves things back and forth. There's ebbs and there's flows, and that's what that principle does. So you can say it is the principle of rhythm is what it is, but what it does is the principle of flowing back and forth in a measured amount of time and consistency, okay, or with predictability, right? Well, the eighth Hermetic Principle, the principle of care, is what it does is it encapsulates the other 7 principles, okay? So let's start here with mentalism or mind. And then you've got correspondence, and then you've got vibration and polarity and rhythm and cause and effect and gender, right? And you can see how they all kind of tie in together. No one of them is any more important than the other. The all kind of encompasses all of them, but it doesn't provide any kind of boundary or structure to any of them. They're just kind of all there and happening all at once. Well, the principle of care is the 8th Hermetic Principle that wraps all the way around them and keeps them bound together. Okay, and this is important. You'll see this in just a second, and you'll see how it seems counterintuitive, but it's because those things get bound together that it then becomes the generative principle. Okay, so let me show you how this works. So if you have the principles and they're just there without being bound together, then they kind of get chaotic. They can like float around all over the place. If you're only thinking about mind, but then you're thinking about rhythm, then it can be like bouncing all over and it doesn't interact with anything else. Or thinking just about polarity, then what does that really mean if it doesn't directly relate to anything else? So the principle of gender just kind of does its own thing, and right, cause and effect is just, you're thinking about it loosely somewhere else. So without that bounding principle, everything just kind of gets chaotic. And and remember that this principle here, this is why I left this one alone. This one doesn't go anywhere because this is the principle of mind in the center. The principle of mind didn't move. You notice that, right? Because all is mental. That's the starting principle, okay? But the principle of mind doesn't bind anything else together. It works with and it interacts with the other ones, but it doesn't keep anything together, all right? So your principle of mind can stay the same, but then your mind can wander. Your mind can go different places. It can, different stuff happens and everything gets kind of like loosely disjointed. Does that make sense? So then what happens is that now, if you start here, in a way, the principle of mentalism then has to come into being in conjunction with the principle of care, right? And also, there's a sense in which, and this is a much deeper topic, but think about it this way, that when there is an entity, whether you call it higher consciousness or your individual consciousness or the collective consciousness or the however you want to visualize that entity then by definition generates constraints. Okay, so like think about this. Think about, and those constraints then create infinite variability within it. So think about this. When if you think about like all the paintings that have ever been made, every single painting that Van Gogh and Da Vinci and Michelangelo and every other painter who's ever existed, Jackson Pollock and like all these guys, right? And they had a finite system that constrains them. Okay, they worked with paint, which meant that they worked with paintbrushes, which meant that they worked with a canvas of some type, right? And so there was only so many things that they could do, and they also just worked with their body. Like they only had a body that they could work with. They couldn't work, they couldn't have angels come and do it, or some of them had elephants do it or whatever. But like if they're painting, they're limited by their physical constraints. And then as you narrow those constraints down more and more, every painter fundamentally in this reality frame is bound by visible light, is bound by pigmentation and the way that visible light reflects off of pigmentation. And that is just 3 colors. We get blue, red, and yellow. Blue, red, and yellow. And that's it. And we can come up with all these different ways to apply blue to red and yellow. We can mix them together and come up with mauve and puce and different purples and lavenders and like all these different beautiful colors that we can mix together. And then we can layer those and interact with those and make them into different shapes and evoke different emotions or take us to different places, or we can do all these like infinite things, right? But they're all constrained. And if we didn't have the constraints, then everything would kind of go haywire. Can you see that? So that's why when I say that the principle of mind, by definition, by itself, cannot be useful unless it is in conjunction with the principle of care. So in a way, you could even say that you could even flip these Hermetic principles around, if this makes it easier for you to think about it this way, is that you could say the first Hermetic principle is actually the principle of mind, and then the second Hermetic principle would be the principle of care, right? Except it's hard for us to visualize it that way, but that might be a different way to think about it, because they have to work in conjunction. Or you could even say that the principle of care is part of the principle of mind. You could look at it that way. But for ease of understanding it, for the ease of visualizing it, it's easier to say that the principle of care encompasses all the other ones. But the other ones can't come into existence and be useful until the principle of care is in place to bind them together. Does it make sense? Because if they're not bound together from the beginning, then it becomes like herding cats and you can't bring them back in, right? So here's what happens then. We have the principle of mind, the principle of care. And now think about this too. The principle of mind then becomes the masculine principle. And used in conjunction with all the other principles, the principle of mind then becomes the masculine principle. The principle of care then becomes the feminine principle. Remember I said that it was the penetrative and the receptive. Masculine is a penetrative, and the feminine principle is the feminine energy rather is the receptive. So you see when and I'll go into this in a lot more detail when I talk about the I am and what that means, and how the things move from the non-real into the real is how we visualize the masculine moving into the feminism. It's why God is so often referred to in the masculine. It's not because it's sexist or whatever, or small-minded. It's because God, the way that we conceptualize of God, is only one half of the all. It's half of the yin and yang. Where we don't conceptualize of God correctly. We conceptualize of God as just the thing that's coming from the unreal and moving into the real. And then we forget about the real, that it's still here. So if you broaden your horizons more and you stop thinking about the Old Testament version of God, or any kind of like those versions of God with like a dude on a throne, or like, Jesus become manifest, or like the one who talks to angels, like the being of light in the sky. Like that's part of the all, right? It's not the whole entire thing. So the all is all of that as well. Okay. So, so then the principle of mind then exists within that, right? Just like, think about this so I'll talk from my personal experience, right? So I'm a man, I've got a job, I've got a career, I was in the military, I was doing all this kind of stuff. I was, flying around the world, I was going crazy, I was having a blast. But I was always constrained because I had a wife, because I had kids. So I couldn't fully just go hog wild, right, and just do all the things that I wanted to do because I was constrained. I was constrained financially, I was constrained emotionally, I was constrained physically. I had these constraints on me because I had that feminine entity in my life, my wife, who held me back. And I don't say that in a resentful way at all, because in many ways it was a beautiful thing to have those constraints on me. Because, God only knows what kind of trouble I would have gotten into in the world if I didn't have to think, oh, I have this constraint. Like, one of the things that I saw repeated over and over and over again with military guys is I saw these guys that had nobody to answer to, nobody to go home to, and then everywhere we went, they would be, just hooking up with whatever females they could find. And this went on for years and years and years. And all of them, towards the end of their careers, if they had never settled down with anybody, were like just not quite right. There was something not quite healthy about them. They're just like, they had this odd weirdness about them, and this is the kind of thing that you see in like modern hookup culture. There's a lot of men who like, you get into your 40s, you get into your 50s, and you realize that like nobody's ever really loved you. Nobody has ever really taken the time to get to know you. Nobody has ever committed to being your partner. It's because you were always so taken with this masculine principle, and always so producing and penetrating and just going out there and doing stuff, and you were never restrained or constrained by anything. And it ends up really doing damage to your mental health over a long period of time. So for that reason, I look at the fact that I had a wife through all those times, and I was constrained. I couldn't just go chase tail everywhere that I went. I couldn't just go be a raging alcoholic all the time. I couldn't just go, take every single deployment that came along, because I had other things that constrained me. But then it's within those constraints, just like an artist has to work with red, blue, and yellow, right? It's the constraints that actually creates the beauty that comes out of life. It's the constraints that were put on me by my relationship to my wife that caused me to dig deeper into my soul and find my true motivations and ask myself why I wanted to do these things, and what were my deeper motivations, and all this other kind of stuff. So I know it's a long way around, but that's how these two principles, the principle of mind and the principle of care, or the generative principle, interact, right? So then what starts happening is you start getting these other principles that come about inside them. Does that make sense? Anyway, so this seems like a record scratch, but hear me out for a second, okay? We'll talk for just a second about rats and epigenetics, and how, and this is another way to visualize how this principle works in real life and how you can start to apply it, okay? So epigenetics, forgive me, I'm just going to read from the slides for just a sec, but so epigenetics is a field of biology that studies how behaviors and environment can affect how our genes work. So there was a study many years ago, and I'm pretty sure it's been duplicated many times, where they took rat pups, baby rats, And they had some that received a lot of attention in their first week of life, including extensive licking and grooming from their mom. And they tended to grow into more calm adults. Whereas on the other hand, rat pups who received little nurturing tended to grow up to be anxious. So their conclusion was that the mother's behavior can influence the way genes are expressed in her pups. And we've seen this in numerous cases in human history where you have infants that were not given the coddling and care that infants need. And when they grow up, they turned out, some of them were just like really very broken people. There was a time in human history, in our recent history, where people believed that babies shouldn't be coddled. They should just be allowed to just cry for a while. Or there were stories that came out of the UK after the World War II where they had all these babies that had, their parents died and they were in orphanages, and they gave them food and they gave them shelter and they kept them clean, they kept them clothed, right? But some of these babies that didn't get cared for and held and coddled and cooed and talked to and all those other sorts of things, they just died. They just didn't thrive. It's because humans, mammals, need that kind of attention, okay? And this is the way, as humans, as mammals, and there's probably some reptiles and maybe some insects, I don't know, I'm not a biologist, but within the field of biology, this is how this principle of care, it's why it's called the principle of care, it's how it gets applied, right? And that's why it's called the generative principle. Because just like when you're doing a painting, you have those constraints. If you go in there and you start doing the work and you just exercise and you move within those constraints, you'll start to produce something. And because of the law of correspondence, just like when you apply those things on the smaller scale and make a painting or a sculpture or whatever it is and use those constraints, it becomes something. When you do that on the mental plane, whatever you start to care about, whatever you start to put yourself into, just like the mother rat puts her attention into those pups and it creates older rats that are more well-rounded, right? And it starts to grow into something better. So you, because you're a human, I'm assuming that you're a human if you're watching this, when you apply this principle of care, you do it when you water your plants, when you feed your pets, when you increase your savings, when you invest in your relationships, when you invest in your children, when you invest in your home, when you like all this kind of stuff. When you put energy into something, that's when it starts to expand. You see how that works? Because that's why it's called the generative principle, because it creates that constraint within which you can start to produce energy, you can put energy in there. But then that thing starts to grow. It starts to become something else. And then as you put more care and nurturing into it, that energy goes in there, but the energy just doesn't flow out. Remember the diagram I had earlier where all like the different principles are just kind of scattered all over the place. If you were just putting energy just into the principle of rhythm, nothing would ever happen. If you put energy just into polarity, nothing would ever happen, right? But when you constrain them and you put them all together, you put energy into that, and you start to learn about it, then you can use those principles together within those constraints and it starts to naturally grow. So what that happens then, if you take these sorts of things that we've talked about, this is then how you can apply it to pursue your dreams and ambitions. In another slide, another lesson, I'm going to talk about the concept that what you want wants you, which is a very important thing. If you just keep that phrase in mind, what you want is wanting you. What you seek is seeking you. Keep that in mind, okay? We'll unpack that a lot more later, but when you use this principle of care, the same way that a mother rat nurtures her pups, or the way that a human mother nurtures her infant and causes it to grow and become healthy and become, pours herself into that, and same fathers do the same thing. In different ways, but it's still that nurturing, it's that principle of care that goes into it. And it is a feminine principle. It's a feminine energy that you're putting into this thing when you pursue your dreams and ambitions, okay? So you could say, so let's go back to this phrase, right? We can say energy flows where attention goes, or that may not even be the best way to think about it. We could say energy flows where care goes. Does it make sense? It's not just where attention, because I can pay attention to something. I just like, there's headphones over here. I can look. I'm looking at the headphones. I'm paying attention to the head. Is any energy going to that? No. I mean, I'm just staring at headphones. I'm paying attention to them. They're moving around. I'm looking at them. But I'm not doing it. Nothing's happening. So where energy flows where attention goes. I'm just not because I'm looking at it. I'm not just paying attention to it. I'm applying the principle of care. So energy flows where care goes. Or a better way to say it might be that energy flows where the generative principle goes. So just like I can use the principle of polarity to understand that it's warm in this room and I want to get it cooler, so I'm using the principle of polarity there, right? I can use the principle of vibration because in order to turn on the air conditioner, I have to use electricity, which is a vibration, and it causes things to spin and, will cause everything to cool down, right? I can use the principle of gender because I want the room to cool down, and the cooling air in that case becomes a penetrative force, and the warm air then becomes a feminine, and the cool air is penetrating into the warmer. You see, I can use all those other sorts of things. But until I apply the generative principle, the principle of care, in other words, get up off my ass and turn on the air conditioner, I can pay attention to it. I can pay attention to the air conditioner. I can pay attention to how hot the room is. I can pay attention to how uncomfortable I am. I can pay attention to all that stuff, but the energy doesn't go to it. You see what I mean? So this saying, energy flows where attention goes, is wrong. Stop saying it. Stop saying it. Energy flows where the generative principle goes. Energy flows where care goes. Make sense? Good. So, what that comes down to, though, is that we're always using the principle of care. You can't not use the principle of care. Okay? So all the 7 Hermetic principles are always in effect. They're never not in effect. All right? And then the 8th, because it binds the others together, is also always in effect. You can't not have it. If you're doing something, you're using it. Does that make sense? So, and we call this process manifestation. So all this fanciness is all just, it's what we say is manifestation. It's just you applying the principle of care, but doing it mindfully and doing it consciously and doing it in a definite direction with a definite intention. Just like me, here in a little while, I'm going to get up and turn the air conditioner back on because I'm hot. That's me manifesting cooler air in my room, right? And there's a sense in which, God could send a rainstorm and it would cool down and I wouldn't have to do it. I don't know, but I'm not going to count on that right now, right? And I know I kind of break a couple of rules with that, but just hear me out for a second, okay? So, now, this next part is going to sound like another record scratch, but again, stick with me, all right? So, when we move through life, like a boat through water, leaving a wake behind us. You can see the boat and the wake. As we're moving through life, we're always manifesting. We're always using the principle of care. We're always using the generative principle in everything that we do, right? So you can look back over your life at the things that you've manifested. You may not even realize that you manifested them. But if you're in a relationship, if you have a pair of socks, if you own a chair, if you, pick anything that seems so mundane, you were using the principle of care to bring that thing about. And so, like I talked about in one of the other lessons, is that we need to detach from the meaning of the things in our lives. Okay? Now that's where this starts to become important. Because we move through life like a boat through water, leaving a wake behind us. And you can see the wake behind the boat, but our wake is the things that are around us. Make sense? Our wake is the things that are around us. So my wake is my challenging relationship with some of my kids, my amazing relationship with my wife, my job, the building where I work in, my Air Force career, like this table that I'm sitting at, the house that I'm living in, like all of those things are the wake. Those are the rippling effect, right? So our current lives are an echo, like the path of the wake. So everything around me is an echo of me using the principle of care. And it's an echo of me manifesting in whatever frame of mind I was in as I was manifesting. Okay? So we have to remember, this is so critical, that the wake doesn't drive the boat, but it's still there. So all these things that are around me, my house, my town, my relationships, my wife, my job, my Air Force career, like all those other sorts of things, right? Those don't define who I am. This goes back to the first lesson where we talked about we apply meaning to the things in our lives. So it's so easy for us to look around our lives, to look at my house, look at the town I live in, and look at my dogs, and look at all that kind of stuff and think that all those things make me. But they don't. I'm me. I'm a sovereign individual. I am, from one point of view, I'm the representative of Sean M. Helgerson Incorporated with a social security number and a military ID and all that kind of stuff, right? But none of those things define who I am. Okay? All of those things are just an echo of me manifesting as I have made this journey through the thing that we call time. Okay? So, as we move through life, we leave an echo, a wake or an echo. Our past concerns reverberate through our lives, and our past accomplishments and failures reverberate through our lives, right? So if you think about the principle of vibration there, everything that you did causes a vibration. Every thought that you've had causes a vibration. You know, it sets up that frequency, like we talked about, and your frequency tends to draw other things that are similar to you. You know, it's the same thing that, like for a long time in my life, you know, because I had inner wounds that I hadn't dealt with, because I had substance abuse problems, I was an alcoholic. I am an alcoholic. But I was still drinking. I was still actively in that life. I was still angry everywhere that I went. I still had these like angst and problems and like things that I hadn't dealt with yet, right? So because I had all of that and I hadn't taken any steps to deal with it, I used to get so frustrated because, and this is a little bit cliche, but I could walk into a room with 10,000 lovely, eligible women who were, you know, successful and had great mental health and everything was going fine in their lives, right? And the one woman who had sexual trauma and a substance abuse problem would run over and put a wedding ring on me. Like that was my life, okay, for a long time. And it wasn't until I was able to heal those sorts of things that I was able to break that pattern, right? And that's what I mean. That's how your frequencies draw those things to you, right? That's us manifesting. So even though what I had to realize is that like that pattern that I saw in my life wasn't me. It's because it's how I was being in the world and how I was applying the generative principle. Make sense? So, our present shows us how we used the generative principle in the past. So, if you're not happy with your present, change how you're using the generative principle. Now, in later lessons, we'll talk about how to go deep and find those limiting beliefs and find those other sorts of things and those things that need to be healed and clearing them out and airing them out. We'll get into all that kind of stuff, okay? But I just want you to kind of understand this for now. So let's do a quick recap. The generative principle, or the principle of care. So we talked about the generative principle and how it binds the other principles together. We talked about how the principle is a feminine energy. It's nurturing, healing, nourishing, restorative, and erotic. We didn't talk about the erotic, actually. But that's a whole other subject. Maybe that's something we can discuss over in school.com. And then we talked about how you can use the generative principles to pursue your hopes and dreams and to build our lives. We talked about how we are constantly manifesting, and so our lives are an echo of how we were and what we did in the past. And then we talked about the echo, or the wake doesn't define the boat like it doesn't define us. It's just the evidence of who we were in the moment. Okay? So I know we covered a lot, but this is really, really important stuff to understand. I'd like you to take some time and go through this again. Take some notes. Like, really, really unpack this stuff and really, really digest this stuff. And I ask that you go through these lessons just like, take 1 week at a time, but this one might take more. Maybe, take this, meditate on it for a week before you move on to the next lesson, but then keep coming back to it, because this is so fundamental to the rest of the things that you're going to have to understand. Okay? So I'll be back in a second. We'll go back through the workbook and continue from there. All right. Thanks. Be right back. Okay, so here we are. We're back into the workbook, and this is fundamentals number 3, the principle of care, where energy goes. Where attention goes, energy flows. We talked about this quite a lot. So the summary is, and these are the things I wanted you to be thinking about. The things that get your attention tend to increase. Remember, we broke that down quite a bit, in that when you're using the principle of care, the genetic principle, the generative principle, as you are applying that, as you're applying energy to something, applying proper attention to something. I talked about in the slides that this phrase is kind of a misnomer. It's pretty incorrect, because it's not where attention goes, energy flows. It's more like where the generative principle goes, or where care goes, energy flows. Okay? So the things that get your attention, not just your attention, but your energy, your care, your generative principle, all those sorts of things tend to increase. Like, remember we talked about the rat mother and the pups, and we talked about human mothers and, infants that grow and do well, or like when you water your plant, or talk to your plants, or any of that kind of stuff. Those sorts of things tend to increase. Just like when you give your attention to a business idea, give your attention to a sport endeavor, whatever it is, when you apply that generative principle to it, it tends to increase. Okay? The things you care about most start to adjust your frequency. So as you're doing that, you start to interact with them, and then you start to create the wake of your life. But then the thing with the wake that is in your life is we tend to identify with those sorts of things, and we think that those define us, right? But they don't really, even though we think that they do. And so the things that you care about most in your life tend to adjust your frequency. So for me, I'm an alcoholic. When I cared most about consuming alcohol, I consumed more alcohol, and my life got worse, and things got out of control, and my relationships failed, right? But when I cared most about getting promoted in the military, and studying and getting doing things the right way, and getting education and meeting my requirements and that kind of stuff, then those sorts of things tended to increase. So it's not always just a positive thing. It's whatever you're putting the principle of care into. It can be positive or negative. It can go either way. It doesn't matter. But the things that you care about most start to adjust your frequency, because as you get deeper into alcoholism, more opportunities come along for you to reinforce being an alcoholic. As you get deeper into building a business, more opportunities come along for you to build a better business. As you get deeper into focusing on building and curing and healing your relationship, more opportunities come along for you to build and heal your relationship. Okay? Because the things you care about most start to adjust your frequency. They don't define who you are, but the world, the things that are around you, adjust your frequency, and the more you care about them, the more those things come back into your life. That's like the more complicated way of looking at the more nuanced way of looking at the mirror principle. Okay. So, and then this is the crux of it, is that your frequency attracts objects and events and people that are a match. And we just talked about that. Okay. So, here's your assignment for this week, or today, I don't know, whenever you want to do it. So describe the generative principle in your own words. That should be easy. Haha, right? It's not an easy thing to do. But in my words, I think the easiest thing to say is that it's changing the idea of where attention goes, energy flows, to where the generative principle goes, energy flows. Or where care goes, energy flows. Because remember in the slides I talked about, like, I can pay attention to my headphones. Look, I'm paying attention to my headphones. And they're not changing because they're headphones. And attention isn't the right word. But if I apply the principle of care, and I nurture them, and I care about them, and I talk about them, and I write reviews about headphones, and I'm just like, oh, I become a headphone guy, then guess what? People will start sending me free, headphones to review. And I'll start getting better and better headphones, and I'll learn so much about headphones, and I'll care about headphones. That's when the energy comes. Does it make sense? So that's how I would do it. I would change that phrase from where attention goes, energy flows, to where care goes, energy flows. Okay, so now this is the hard part. And I'd like you to go into school.com / Finding Fuscata and write this up if you feel comfortable with it. If not, that's great. But look at the world around you. If it's true that our life is an echo of our past cares, thoughts, and vibrations, list at least 3 things that you apparently cared about. So for me, if I look at 3 things, like if I look at my waistline, I'm heavier than I'd like to be. So apparently at one point in time, I cared about drinking alcohol and eating ice cream. I put my active attention. I applied the principle. I applied the generative principle into wearing bigger pairs of pants. Okay. Another thing would be that this house that I live in, I had a vision of a house that I wanted to live in. My wife and I both had a vision of a house that we wanted to live in. We knew the town we wanted to live in. And we put our attention, we put our care into bringing that about, and we did it. So I would say the third thing is my daughter. There's a whole story that I have about how she came about and how I manifested her into my life. But it's a longer term thing, because I wasn't actively seeking to do that, but I was putting in the mental care, which is another level, which we'll talk about in other lessons. I was putting in the mental care into generating that, and then eventually bringing her into my life. So those are my 3. Anyway, thanks for sticking around this long. I really appreciate it. Appreciate your time. If you are interested in more content like this, definitely subscribe on YouTube. Definitely go over to school.com. That's SKOOL.com / Finding Fuscata. And apply to join our group. There's a waiting list in there. Join the waiting list. Have a conversation with us. And, if you're a good fit, then great. If you're not, also great. But we have an amazing group of people, fantastic conversations. We go really deep into this kind of stuff, okay? And we would love to have as many people as possible as part of that. Within findingfuscata.com, school.com / Finding Fuscata, you'll also find a coaching program that's available where you can get one-on-one coaching with me. And at very, very reasonable rates. I'm not here, trying to make a cajillion dollars. I'm not trying to scam anybody. I just legitimately want people to understand these principles and learn how to apply them in their lives. So I have, I call them investment levels. If you want to invest just a little bit and get an hour of one-on-one with me, then it's very, very affordable. Or all the way up to, if you want to, commit to doing the full 6-month program, and you want to meet with me for an hour twice a week, then I have an investment level for that too. Or if you don't want to do any of that, depending on whatever your budget is or what your time constraints are, you can just download these slides, download the book, do the work, join school.com, have the discussions in there. The important thing is to do this work and to make the changes in your life and to take this information and just really, really ingrain it in who you are. So anyway, that's my plug. That's my spiel. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're being kind to each other. I hope you're being kind to yourself. Definitely be kind to yourself. And hopefully, if all goes well, we'll meet up over in our school community. Or, yeah, anyway. I'm never sure how to end these things, so there should be like some dancing music. Blah, blah, blah. I don't know. Whatever. Anyway, lots of love. Take care.
My appetite.